All right. So, as far as the inflationary issue is concerned, obviously, that will be something we're about to get to. And it's a fascinating issue, as everyone knows from their German history, or indeed from the history of 20th century Europe. We continue today with talking about the world after World War I and the war to end all wars, which sadly was not the kind of world that people had hoped for. Okay. The so-called Weimar Germany, and we all are aware that it enjoyed that name simply because of the creation of the Constitution there, rather than the site of the government. It was simply known to history as Weimar Germany, although that was not the official name. It was, of course, the German Republic, and as you see, a very short-lived one, due to all of the reasons that really stood against its survival. Had it not been for this or that or the other, maybe, but again, there's no need for arguing that. The reality is that it did not have a life insurance policy. It was in many ways created out of defeat, and not because people really wanted it. There was no plebiscite of German voters in saying this would be great, so you need to say ja or nein or something of that sort. Well, that just wasn't the way it was. It was created as the way, in many ways, the military leadership of Germany to end the previous regime so that the Weimar Republic could then approach the winners and say, 14 points, 14 points, we love you. We don't want war anymore. It didn't work, but they were stuck with the Weimar Republic. Speaking of previous governments, if you're in the Netherlands, you can stop by and take a tour of the home. If you ever wonder how ex-emperors live, I would say not badly. This, I mean, it's bad to be an ex-emperor. I'm thinking you're always dreaming when the phone rings, and I guess the servant would pick it up, I'm sure. I don't think the ex-emperor or the empress would have answered their own phone. I'm sure they had servants to do that. But you're always thinking, I bet it's Berlin. They want me back. It's like a famous star on, Norma Desmond, Sunset Boulevard, that kind of thing. I think it could be another contract. But yeah, it didn't happen. And he would remain there, and not altogether positive about Adolf Hitler and the Nazis. In any event, he died in 1940 in the safety of the Netherlands. And I say safety because there was some talk about bringing him to some sort of international justice, as if he had caused the Great War, and so now he can take it. But, of course, they had to go through the Dutch to get him, and so that's how he got to breathe his last in peace and security, and a good income, because we want that in retirement, don't we? So yeah, it's like if you ever wonder about having to scrape up a few coins, no, he was very secure, he and the Empress. I can promise you, when they got their moving van, you see the U-Haulets. They had a lot of U-Haulets because they had lots of paintings and furniture. And those were just those few days in November of 1918, those who keep up with dates, because they had to move fast. Yeah, because a treaty is coming to a place near you and you're not part of it. So they had to get them out. So to get all the way to the Netherlands for safety, and they brought all those possessions. So I always think that's sort of interesting to think about in the Netherlands. It doesn't mean necessarily that the Dutch government was approving of him, but they were definitely approving of their neutrality, and it was not challenged as far as I know, as far as he was concerned. But he lived out his days and died in 1914, ironically, when the German troops came through the Netherlands. Isn't that wild? I mean, to think about that actually happened, but they just went by and waved or something. I don't think there was any kind of business, even though I think perhaps there were family members who were involved in the German army, but he was, of course, not involved personally. Now, I want to tell you about this painting. It was done in 1920 when Clemenceau was about 80 years old. And you'll love this. It is in Washington, D.C. at the Smithsonian. I know, and you're thinking, why the Smithsonian? I thought you'd never ask. Because it was an American artist, a woman American artist. Isn't that something? The reason being that the American government in, say, 1919, 1920, had commissioned a series of paintings of important leaders during World War I. And so this particular artist from, I believe, Massachusetts, Cecile Beau is her name, what's her name, died in 1945. So, I mean, she was not young at this time, but still, she had to go to Europe, go to France. And of course, he put her off and delayed her and this and that, the other, and said, I don't have time. You know how folks can be. I mean, even your portrait, but there were lots of portraits of Clemenceau, don't you worry. But he stopped work, and you see, he stood by his desk, almost 80 years old. And he stood by his desk, and she painted it. But she'd already, had, I don't know much about art, but I gather that she had already done a lot of the preliminaries so that she would not keep him busy, because I'm thinking that he wouldn't have been too happy had she done so. In other words, it's like, you got this time, lady, so do your bit, and then that's on, as they say. And that's exactly what happened in 1920. And I might add, as far as that goes, that was almost the end of Clemenceau's career. And he, you know what he wanted? He wanted to be president of France. He was the premier. And you know how that's different. President means you're sort of like a king or an emperor. When you don't have those, you're sort of like term limited monarch, but he never got it. So, and he never, well, I mean, at 80, I think he had accomplished quite a bit, so he had nothing to apologize for. And of course, if you want to stay on his good side, you don't say, you know, I don't think that guy Bismarck was so bad. I think I really liked him. I mean, how about Berlin, baby? No, I don't think he was ready for any love and peace with the Germans. I mean, if you bring up the subject, you'll be sorry. It's more, and of course, I'm not sure he was exactly happy if you brought up the United States and Britain, because he didn't feel they had come through. More or less, the situation with Clemenceau was he had a very, very major career, but sometimes in politics, people do not always stay with you, can be somewhat perfidious. And in this case, of course, Clemenceau would die in relative obscurity. I think it's interesting he was married to an American, not happily, but he was married, and a marriage that had long ended before. So he was a very interesting person and a major figure. And now, of course, he just wants to see what can be done about the German problem. Whether I'm in government or not, this is what I want, says Georges Clemenceau. But as we always know, it doesn't mean that everybody in France looks at Clemenceau and says, je t'aime, je t'aime. I mean, that is just not the way of our human beings, is it? It's like some like him, particularly those on the left wing, and say, hey, George, you want to go to mass with me? And then you would just see he is anti-church to the extreme. Yes, he is Republican, leftist, not communist, but leftist, and he more or less represents all the values. Oh, bring up Dreyfus Affair or any of that and just go crazy. Yeah, you know, all of the ideas that we associate with the Third Republic, Clemenceau was there. So he had plenty of enemies, but I'm sure he was happy for them. However, any French enemy would always be better than the German. You never forget that. It's not like, oh, I just love you both. No, I just think it's level of dislike or hatred, whatever you want to call it. It's fascinating. But I did think when you're in Washington, and if you ever see this portrait of Clemenceau, you'll think of a female American artist. And she did other portraits of mostly people of wealth and distinction. I don't think you would find the proletariat represented well there. I think cardinals and people of high distinction. I found a map. Does anyone recognize, some polyglot out there recognize the language? No, I was wondering if anybody knew. I had no clue about when I looked at it, but it's okay. We know what it is. We see Czechoslovakia and Hungary. It's just not spelled in our way. And you say, Oh, that's true love. Well, I'll say it's an alliance. I'll give you that much. It's called the Little Entente, which has a cutesy sound to it, doesn't it? I mean, it's like, what does that really mean? Well, we know an entente is an understanding. Let's have an entente. It doesn't mean I want to go out with you. No pizza. We're not going to share pizzas. With none of that, get a Netflix account together. None of that. Share our notes, any of that. But it means that we're willing to work together because we don't like the one in the brown. And you say, haven't you eaten enough of these people? They love to eat up that Hungary. And you know why? Because they can. Nobody's going to say, you don't be mean to Hungary. We love Hungarians. No, we don't. They are part of the ones we don't like. So it's more or less they come together because of that. And now we can tie in Clemenceau and the French. And you know why? Because special call from Paris to Little Entente to Prague people, as in Czechoslovakia. How would you like to be, as they would say in Gilligan's Island, our little buddy? Because that is exactly what will happen. The Little Entente with France. And you say, why would the Little Entente be interested in France? Because the French might send us a check, you know, a little reward for being good. And from the point of view, seriously, of the French, we love having people in the East who don't like Hungary. Because you see, Hungary, former ally of Germany, both being knocked around right now. So there's always that possibility that Hungarians will reach out to the Germans. So we like these other people. Could it be I'm falling in love? I mean, it's we don't need the spinners. We got it right here, don't we? We have Czechoslovakia, Romania, Yugoslavia. It's very, very interesting. And that is, as you see, all the way up this relationship till 1938. And of course, by that point, an appeasement, it kind of is going to come to an end, but that's long after the period with which we are concerned. Now, here is one of our favorite Scots and an individual from this period. Now, I was just talking to a special person in this class about Reds and Pinkos, and even those who are a little more than liberal, somewhere between liberal and socialist. He becomes the first, hold your breath, Labor prime minister. Ooh. Now, he doesn't look mean, does he? He's all done up. You don't look dangerous. We don't see him wearing like clothes or taking his lunch pail there in the mill or anything. No, he looks prim and proper. But he was a trade unionist. Oh, he had the credentials, all the credentials that were necessary. And I actually found on YouTube his voice. And if you like that Scottish brogue, boy, he's got it big time. And he becomes, perhaps because of great political success and because of his own skills, the first prime minister of the Labor Party. And I am sure that if you were of the conservative / Tory vintage, that you were saying, oh God, the world is going to hell in a handbasket, because he lasted less than a year. So I don't want to go wild here. There's no kind of utopia coming for Trotskyites or others, I promise. It didn't last, but he was coming up with all these programs of social reform and lots of taxes and all of the rest that one would expect. And of course, it quickly came to an end. However, as usual, nothing ever ends with just the issue of, the labor authority and influence, or these kinds of political changes, because outside, of course, we have the issues of Ireland. That never stops, does it, in terms of what British policies have to be. I don't think the Irish are going like, oh, well, this is so exciting to have a labor leader. Let's just hold off our Irish movement and see what works out. No, I don't think so. So they've got that, and Lord knows they've got issues with, shall I name them? India, South Africa, on and on it goes. You think, is anybody happy? I'm not so sure if you're part of the empire, because that is a constant mess. All of these are issues, and of course, I thought that was an interesting business, because I actually went to a restaurant in London called the General Strike. I was years ago. It may not exist anymore, but I just got so caught up in it, and I thought, wow, I was asking the waiter, gosh, are you interested in 1926? And he looked at me. I just don't think he was a history major. Okay. And I was just kept myself quiet after that. I know how to behave sometimes. But yes, it's so interesting. Of course, as you would imagine, the issue of the mines and the whole power of collectivization and the sympathy strike led to, I think it was probably 6 or 7 days they were able to pull this off, and they probably pulled off young men, young women who were willing to do the necessary jobs. Young men, young women who were of the middle class, who were able to do the necessary jobs to defeat the strike. As a matter of fact, I do have an Auburn story to tell you, which you might find interesting, because I doubt anybody was around, because at that time, there was an almost strike in Auburn by the workers of what we used to call grounds. Thank you, B&G. Thank you, Dennis. Yeah, B&G. Oh, have y'all ever heard that they used to call it that? The buildings and ground. And suddenly they said there were unionists, organizers coming from Columbus, or maybe even further. I know. Trouble in Lee County. Yeah. Hanco's. Yeah. And as one student came up to me, she said, I don't know if I can come to class. She said, my daddy is worried about the strike. And I said, oh, it'll be all right. They won't bother you, because I don't want you to have to miss class. We didn't have Zoom back then. So she was worried about some labor organizer was going to beat up students. Well, as it turned out, when they threatened to go out, the president of Auburn at that time, And some of you may have known him, Dr. Harry Philpott. Probably present when you were a student, Judy, as I think. He said, now you've got until the next shift to come back to work. Oh, you're an ex-employee of Auburn University. And that made it so easy. But I mean, he didn't say, well, let's just talk about it, or maybe we can all work it out. Life is good. Age of Aquarius. No. There's not going to be any foolishness here. So that was the end of that. What makes it interesting, though, is that the Auburn students were lined up to do all the jobs, like clean up the offices. And so I mention that simply because that is one way they broke the strike. This general strike, it was called, because this was a term that developed sort of the anarchist dream. If you remember the anarchist, the violent terror, was the idea everybody goes out. Nothing can happen as far as getting jobs done. So you just bring everything to a halt. But then suddenly comes all of these people who are in class, and they may have cliff notes. People of that sort, and they say, well, I've got the cliff notes, so I can do a job. Yes, we know about students like that. And so, yeah, and we know, of course, that they actually broke it and the people went back to work, but they weren't happy about it. Not happy at all. Now, that's about 1926. Think about it. Ramsey MacDonald had come and gone. We're back to the conservatives. But yes, Britain had lots and lots of issues of its own. We never forget that. So you can think externally, internally, whatever you want to, as far as the British are concerned. And then the League of Nations, how sad. But some of you have said you've been to Geneva, and I hope you've had a chance to visit these structures. They are all now utilized by the United Nations. And of course, you go to Geneva. Of course, you may think of just Banks or Lake Geneva, but there's a lot to see and do. I'm not pushing Geneva trips, but I do think it's quite interesting from the historic point of view, even if you're not a Calvinist, because of course it's now, I know, but there are a lot of Calvin sites. I mean, if you get into that, but this, of course, and you'll notice it's actually named. It was named in 1924. For Woodrow Wilson, yes, because he is the sacred one. I mean, it's like Holy Wilson. I mean, as far if you were a league person, this is the ideal. Now, this is not the big headquarters that we think of. This is just called the Palais Wilson. There is a major edifice that would be created in 1936. Not that both are not very significant. And I'm thinking, how could all of this be paid for? I worry about these things. Don't you know? I mean, you think, surely they're not going to make the Germans pay for it, since they won't even allow the Germans in it. So they certainly not going to say, well, you have to cough up the money for the League of Nations. Okay, since you all are so smart, going to make A's, I think. Rockefellers, the filth of lucre, yes. Rich people. You say, but I thought the United States wasn't a member. That's okay. There's still rich Americans who get involved with all these causes. And the cause of international peace is what shall I say, very big at this time, regardless of what the international perspective of the American government is. And I just find that very interesting to realize that American capital is so huge at this time that, of course, it's vitally involved with the development of this international organization. And you'll notice that it doesn't officially go out of existence until 1946. But it had been essentially defunct in terms of not just the aspects that we know about, because usually we think of the political aspects, but just like the UN today, most of its work is very unknown for most people, like social and economic work and that sort of thing. Even anti-slavery movements, for goodness sakes, in various parts of the world, which I found interesting in reading about the League of Nations. That and here was the map to show you how it all develops. Now we notice the gray areas. We always do that. You see the United States and, of course, Mexico. But then go south. It's virtually all blue. Virtually every Latin American government is a member. I thought it was interesting also to note that that which is this lighter blue, which indicates areas that are colonial in nature. You look how much of the world was colonial at that time. So that means you're coming along. That's just like you're still under your parents. So I'm a member, you're a member, basically. However, you see Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, even India, they have separate memberships, which I think is interesting also. Even though they're part of His Majesty's regime, they're still entitled to their separate positions. We have, of course, the bad boy Germany, not a member. And of course, no reds allowed. So the Soviet Union, you didn't get an invitation? Well, there's a good reason for that, losers. So we are not speaking to you. And then we noticed, our favorites, the mandates. Remember the mandates, folks. They are the states. We are just looking after y'all. Someday you'll thank us. We love you very much, and we're going to care for you. And when we think you're ready, you know what we're going to do? Give you freedom. But we'll have an evaluation, ratemymandate.com, and then we'll know when you're ready. But so you'll notice, suspiciously like former German territories in Africa and otherwise. Those are mandated territories. So obviously they're not going to be members of the League of Nations. But that said, if you look at all that is blue or mandated, you'll see most of the world. Now, I'm sure Frank knows, but it took me some time. I suddenly looked up there and I said, there's Greenland. Yeah. So, I mean, you can get quite the interesting image of the world at that particular time. But you got to admit that the world really responded favorably, for whatever reason, to a world organization, because there never been anything like this in history. And much of it was very idealistic in nature. Let's not, and it's not just Woodrow Wilson, believe me, he was operating on the ideals of many an American, many British individual and others who believed that without these kinds of organizations, there would never be peace. And of course, most importantly, disarmament. Because until we do something about weapons of war, there will always be that danger. So it is very important that we deal with that. Well, particularly if you had been around, walking around the streets of any British or French city and saw how many injured veterans there were, or people whose fathers, brothers. I just assigned actually a paper to a student on a famous pacifist that I may have mentioned to you. If I haven't, let me do so. Her name was Vera Brittain. God, she lived until 1970, and she was a nurse in World War I. Yeah. And she dedicated the rest of her life after World War I to the cause of pacifism. And it's not easy to be a pacifist as World War II starts. But she lost both her brother and her fiance in World War I. And so very, very interested person. They actually made a movie about her in 2018. Have you seen it? I figured it would be a little romantic, but
sad.
Sad. I think sad would be a good word for it. Yeah, I mean, it's a tragic life, but she married, I mean, and had a family and on, but yeah, that's a long, long life. I think 1865 to 1970 something. So it's very impressive longevity. So I guess pacifism is good for your health, but she was very, very involved. And I think that's interesting because I think I had some of my nursing majors into my office, and I went into a Vera Brittain spiel, and I don't think, because they had, a lab right after my class, and I was just discussing, what you might see as nurses, and I don't think they wanted to hear that, but it's like, I couldn't do it. I don't know about you, but it's mighty noble to know people like that. Here he is, the boy from Augusta. Yes, that's Augusta, Georgia. He was his father's career as a Calvinist minister is always before him, and fascinating character, really. The president of Princeton, so many things we can say about him, both positive and negative. But certainly at the time of which we are speaking, he was in many ways a great hero, but at the same time, at home, he was, shall we say, of mixed reputation, because not as people today would view him as some sort of Southern racist, but because he did not seem capable of working with others who didn't agree with, which can be very tough when you are in a situation like this. The official portrait definitely, I think, bespeaks of someone of high principles and high ideals. And that can be good, but it can also be very dangerous if people don't agree with you, or at least they say, maybe we can look at it a different way. Well, when you have your mind, you say, no, there is one way, my way. And, maybe that worked for the president of Princeton University, maybe even governor of New Jersey, which he was. But it was very difficult when he was president. I always think if we hadn't been involved with World War I, and he could have just focused on the domestic agenda, maybe it would have worked out. And also, of course, because he had a Republican Congress to deal with. And we all know that politics can be unpleasant, particularly if you don't want to negotiate. And he didn't. So he didn't like them and they didn't like him. So it's like no olive branches. And that was November 1918. And when he came back from the negotiations, early summer of 1919, he began a series of speeches all over the United States, which led him into the West and various other areas. I think mostly about train, if I'm, as far as I'm aware, that's where he had the strokes. But as of these talks, he used the phrase breaking the heart of the world, meaning that if we do not go into the League of Nations and accept this world responsibility. So that was why the phrase becomes so important, because he used it constantly. And of course, he was unable, unwilling, whatever the phrase would be, to accept any kind of compromises, because the congressional Democratic leaders always told him that if he would accept certain modifications based on their Republican colleagues, and he said, nope, there won't be any. And apparently the Democrats did just what he said. In other words, they were not willing to go against him. And we all know how that will lead. That will lead to an organization which is essentially Anglo-French. Not that American philanthropists won't spend plenty of bucks in Geneva. Don't worry about that. Like I say, Rockefellers and others would spend a great deal of money in the development of the League. Because let's face it, what is it they say about those folks there? Oh, I hope you're never like this. Cash strapped. Oh, that sounds bad. I don't ever want to be like that. So if you know of people, keep them away from me, because that's not good. And I'm thinking these French and British were cash strapped. So when you're getting a certain, shall we say, influx of American capital, it's a good thing, real good thing. So seriously, folks, it's like there had to be a lot of private money going into that. As far as the British and French are concerned, the French are thinking, I don't think they would publicize this, but I think among themselves they were thinking, you know what the purpose of the League is for us? You know why we pay our dues? You know why we sit there in the council? I'll give you a hint. It starts with G and ends in Y, and it has 3 syllables. Keep them down. And they say, well, that's not a nice thing to say. Well, we don't say it publicly. We just say it among us. But you know, they thought about this in the words of Cole Porter, day and night, night and day. I mean, it's like we want the League of Nations because they give us a sense of security. A sense of security, I might add, that the Americans and British had sort of alluded to, but decided not to come through. That's the truth, because there was a part of the Paris Peace Settlement that if the French were ever attacked, yes, the British and the Americans would be there to help. Well, once the Americans backed out of the Treaty of Versailles, the British said, sorry, wish you Frenchies all the best, but we can't help you. You know, we're cash strapped. Yeah, that's always a good argument, isn't it? So, yeah, those Yanks, we just can't trust them. But you see, that allows the French to get out of it. I mean, the British to get out of it because they don't like the French anyway. So, I mean, it's not like you understand this Anglo-French love thing. It's a lie. So don't fall for it because it isn't true. But as far as the British are concerned, and now we think about Ramsay MacDonald, we've got that pink thing going on, that fear. Yes. The Russians are coming. Remember that movie? The Russians are coming. Yeah. I mean, it's like they are worried to death that they are coming to London. They are dangerous. And the idea being now with the League of Nations, they'll keep those Ruskies away. They won't come near the British Isles. Because, of course, at the formation of the League of Nations, no one could have dreamt that someday, you know, the Soviets are going to clean up their act and get to be in it, much less those Germans. Because let's face it, in 1920, 21, the Germans and Soviets are wicked. They're not on the list of nice people. It's not like, well, I like some Germans. The strudel is wonderful. It's just delicious food. And some of the cities are beautiful. It's like, rate my country. It's like you below average. I mean, it is amazing how this whole culture, I think old German departments had been abolished in various universities. I mean, it's truly amazing. And I certainly don't mention the Reds. Yeah, that doesn't need to be mentioned. I think we all know that. But anyway, we do say it for Wilson because he's out of office in 1921. And the dream was gone and will not, in essence, be revitalized in the sense of the League. The League goes on. However, a lot of people don't realize there were American observers who were participating and saying, in effect, they were sitting there in the meetings and saying, oh, well, that's really nice. Bravo to y'all. Y'all just keep it up. This is really good. Mm-hmm. And then he might, you know, and then the person might call Washington and say, I attended a meeting and you didn't make any commitments though, did you? No, I just told them I thought it was real nice. You know, it's that sort of thing. You just don't want to have any kind of connections. Like say, if you do this, will you do that? So without membership, they could do that. But so it's not really fair, I think, to say that we were totally isolated. We weren't, but we're not committed. So it's a lack of commitment that was hard on the British and French. Robert, the idea here, and you see, is the leader, Henry Cabot Lodge. Some of you all may remember his son, who was actually Richard Nixon's running mate in 1960. Really fine man, I think, ambassador to the United Nations, ambassador to Vietnam during the Kennedy Johnson years. I'm taking you back in time, but some may remember. His father was a Bostonian, the Brahmins, as they called them, and something about, I know this would never happen to you, but Wilson and Lodge looked at each other, and you know what they said? I hate you. I mean, it's like, I don't, the more I see you, the more I love you. It's not like that. It's like loathing from the beginning with a capital L. I mean, it's sad, isn't it? But it's true. I mean, sometimes they had to speak, but it's like as quickly as possible. And remember, he becomes chairman of foreign relations, ironically, in January of 1919, after the election, the by-election, which gave Republicans control of the Senate. And so that's why you see what I think is clearly a pro-democratic, pro-Wilson vision of, what Cabot Lodge is going to do to the treaty, which is create a very, very ill treaty, because you don't want to be in all that. I know I wouldn't. Orthopedic surgery, I think, get prepared. The idea being, of course, that the treaty was never ratified, and so there would be a Treaty of Berlin in 1921, because all of this was scratched. Some people have said if Wilson had just, worked a little bit with the Republicans, maybe you don't have to like them, you can just work with them. Mm-hmm. And, he told those other Democrats, don't you do it. Because, so that is that. But it's an interesting saga to read about. And then, of course, Mrs. Wilson and her role, the Edith Gall Wilson, who didn't believe in women's suffrage, but she ran the government for a lot of time. And they didn't allow the vice president to know anything. He wanted, his name was Thomas Marshall, of Indiana. And apparently the most famous thing he said was, what this country really needs is a good 5-cent cigar. And yeah, I know. And she think, well, that's profound. Yeah. And, apparently he tried to get in, Mrs. Wilson, I'm sorry, the president's really busy, so maybe you come back another time. I mean, this is just, it was an unreal situation. And this was during the early part of the 1920s. So it was a terrible time. So then, of course, to get to what Frank pointed out to us, inflation that no one can even imagine. And it's thinking, if you do an economic history, and I think everyone understands, of course, the value of money. And even now, you think about, you go back in time and you look at some purchases you made, and you think, I can't believe things cost so little. Remember gasoline prices? And now, if we can get it for $3, some of us are happy. I mean, the nature of inflation is such. I had years before because I would have to say, probably when you were my grandma, I could say, well, inflation is something I have to tell you about because we just did not have that inflation for years between, what would you say, the mid 80s and to the present day. Now, I can remember having a mortgage for 12%, in the late 70s, early 80s. So those of you who say those were bad times, yes, they were quite bad if you want to have a home. But all of that is to say that the Germans were slow to begin their payments. Now, if we want numbers, I have one for you. Article 231 of the Versailles Treaty. Article 231, the Germans were forced to say they and their allies were responsible for the war. And if you're responsible for the war, then all of the bills are on you. Well, of course, the Germans signed it because they had to. There was a blockade. Women and children couldn't get food. So all of this is to say that now Germans are required to begin payments, and these are, as they say, extended over a long period of time. And the Germans, like, I guess, people who don't want to have to pay off their debts, say, well, it's a little tight this month, or whatever people say to get out of paying off debts. The idea being that more or less it is a very, very difficult situation. And the Belgians and French are not impressed. It's like if you have debts and somebody says, oh, I want to, but I just can't. Not this month, maybe next month, negotiators. They have all kinds of negotiators, reparations commission and all of that. It needn't slow us down just to know that finally the French and Belgians, not the British who didn't want any of this mess, but French and Belgians said, we want our payments, and you Germans, you better start paying. And when the Germans were still being slow, that's when we began what you see here. And it's basically the occupation of the Ruhr. That is a major industrial area. And this is after, of course, Clemenceau's time, right? Remember our friend Clemenceau? But he was always interested in this because he predicted, he always said, those Germans, there will always be so many of them, and they will always have this economic power. And we French, we don't reproduce a lot, and so we don't have many people, and we're a poor mouth a lot, as you know. So it's just not right. So the Belgians and French move into this area and say, okay, then we'll just take over this area, and your profits from the mines and so forth, the industry, we'll take it. Since you won't pay, we'll help you pay. Yeah, take that. And so you say, well, I don't think this is doing good for international relations and harmony. But I don't think the French and Belgians are really concerned about International Love Day. Do you? I think they want the payments, and it's ugly, very ugly. And of course, 1923, the Germans ironically go on strike, and the result will be inflation on a scale unimaginable, because we just stopped printing that money. And that is a scary, scary thought. And again, many of us have seen the illustrations of people who could decorate their homes with money because the money was so worthless. The stories of I suppose it was the Deutschmark, if I'm not, maybe I'm wrong, but the mark, whatever sort, but they were obviously worthless. And what it means for our purposes is that the French and Belgians were in many ways foiled by this. I mean, they had not certainly accomplished what they brought about, but then at the same time, the Weimar government was so discredited. If you think about it that way, nobody's coming out a winner, if you ask me, except maybe the Nazis or other groups of that sort who say, now you see, we are getting shafted by everybody, and it's just not fair. And so we need to change. Oh, yeah. You see them there? Mm-hmm. How about these are the troops coming in? Yeah, to make sure, to try to, I'm sorry. Yeah, French troops, French and Belgians, to enforce the control of the ruler, see, because now we're going to rule it. And they thought the Germans were going to work and say, yeah, that's okay. We love our mining work. Our careers in mining means so much to us. Yeah, I'm thinking, yeah, really? We're a bunch of Frenchies and Belgians? I don't think so. I mean, I don't think mining is exactly fun. I've never gotten in a cave, but I'm telling you, I don't think I would exactly, don't think my lungs would do well with that. So, here you go. Oh, Lord George, this is like just a alum reunion, isn't it? Because we were thinking about Clemenceau, and now, Lord George, he's going to be around for quite a while. Yeah, our favorite Welshman. There he is. He's been a big shot at the British representative. Don't bring any Australians to him because he doesn't care for them. But Lord George decided, along with other world leaders, that a nice idea would be for all the major nations of Europe to meet together to talk about international economic concerns. And why not do it in a nice place? And as many of you know, who've traveled a lot, Genoa, Italy is a very nice place to go. I mean, not on the tourist bureau, and I don't get a cut, but I'm just telling you, if you're Euros or such, lira, as we used to say, you may think about that along the coast of Italy. So they were going to meet there, and look who's coming. Yes, of course. The French, Belgians, everybody. And you say, you mean the bad boys? Yeah, even they're invited. Could you imagine when they come in? You know, we've hugged everybody. How y'all doing? Come on in. And then suddenly when those Ruskies come in, how you doing? You know, hostile, a little frigid. Yeah, where's my hug? You're not getting one. And certainly not you Germans. This is 1922. We haven't recovered the love. Yeah, no. So, and at Genoa, can you imagine if you loved Economics 101, you would have loved being at Genoa. Let's put it that way, because all of those issues way above the heads of some of us. But it was impossible when the Germans and French began to talk about reparations. I don't think they were exactly going, we, yeah, and you know, a big Franco-German hug. No, it was like, if you get the issue of reparations and how they're going to be paid, I think somehow the Germans got tired of listening. And somehow those red rascals, those Bolsheviks said, hey, you want to have a meeting? Yeah. You think maybe we could get together a few miles down the road? You say, oh my goodness, a clandestine rendezvous? Well, I don't know how clandestine it was, but it was a rendezvous with just the two of them invited. And this was in Rapallo. And again, you notice they picked really nice places to me, because I wanted to look at that. I would go there. I would go there. I mean, you could just get me a fairly decent room, private bath. I don't do that. I don't share, but I don't. And some, you know, Wi-Fi, and I'm fine. Okay, so, but this is the way it looks now. So you can. I mean, it's nothing painful about this. And they met, and you think those other delegates there in Genoa are mad as wet hens, fit to be tied, whatever, because they've gotten together. And you see the short ones, slightly plump, Georgy Chicherin. He was the lead Bolshevik, the leading Soviet representative. And see the tall one, he's the German. It's like, gosh, it's so great to see you. How you doing, Redman? You know, that kind of thing. I'm wondering what that would have been like. It's like, nothing could have been as bad as breath or coughs. No, I mean, it's like, but they got together, and of course, they want to talk about a favorite topic of many people, and that's money. And how do you feel about the British and French? Well, they hurt our feelings. You don't like them then? No. What about you? No, we don't either. Could it be that we have a relationship? And they think, gosh, we never thought we would like communists, but yeah, I know, it's like, seems strange and wonderful. Yeah, they're in Republic. It's like, it's very strange, isn't it, to think about the fact of how dislike of others can bring us together with someone that we would never have dreamt that there was going to be a relationship. But that was true between Chicherin and these Germans. And what it meant was that for the first time, and again, remember, nobody likes either one of them, and that hurts. So I know, Jane, we can't imagine that. I know you're popular. And it's hard to believe to be a German or Soviet, and then you're, say, I don't like those French and British. Well, I don't either. Do they like you? No. We have enough. Borscht, Wiener Schnitzel. Yeah. Can be very ecumenical. But seriously, it's got a lot to do with foreign aid projects because the Soviets could definitely use some of that German capital. You think, well, I thought that was in reparations. Well, it's supposed to be, but we have a special fund to draw on. I mean, isn't it amazing? I think somebody was lying to somebody because I think these Weimar Germans would use some of their capital to assist with the Soviets because I would think the Soviet Union in 1922 didn't have 2 kopecks to scratch each other. I mean, think about all the wars they had fought in. I mean, the Soviet Union was not the rich power that it will be later. Well, as far as the Germans are concerned, then they had enormous resources, even though they would sort of not want to pay them over in reparations any more than they had to. So part of it will be the Germans supporting the Soviets financially, and the Soviets are going to allow the Germans to develop their military on Soviet soil. And at the same time, the Weimar Republic will grant the Soviets something no one else had done: diplomatic recognition. And I thought about what that's like, but do you realize that when the Iranian government is not exactly the most popular in the world today, is it? But you realize they have negotiations with the Iranian government, just like I guess they do with the North Korean government. So we realize that diplomatic recognition is a step above just talking to folks. So finally, the Germans and Soviets are going to exchange ambassadors, which was, I think, a very big deal, considering they were both unpopular in the list of most loved countries, I think, most governments. So that's why Chicherin was looking very happy. Let's just not bring up any of the unpleasantries of the past. Now, are you going to be sending a special package to the German Communist Party? Don't tell us about it, okay? We don't want to hear about it. It's like, you know, they don't want to bring up anything that's unpleasant. We both have interests, and Chicherin was an interesting character, and he will bring this off. And boy, I'm going to tell you that Lloyd George was, how did they used to say it back home? Fit to be tied. If you ever heard that phrase, it's very much because he knew they were going to get away. He said, oh, they'll never come up with anything. The Germans and communists, huh? And then when this was announced, you can go back and read about it in the old papers. It's fascinating because they were, the British and the French were furious. But what are they going to do about it? I think this is an interesting individual from German history. Right now, he was, I don't know if I'm mispronouncing that or not, but if I am, I know you'll correct me. Rathenau? Am I doing it? Is that okay? He was, interestingly, an economist, expert, and had worked for the imperial government during the Great War. He was a war mobilization expert. I mean, the guy that, you should say, macroeconomics. Was that in your Cliff Notes? I don't know. One of your more advanced classes. But whenever you think about that, and then you think that he was a minister in 1922, and he helped bring about this relationship with the Soviets and Jewish. But you see, the Jewish people in 1922 or 1917, for that matter, did not realize that they were going to be victims of anti-Semitism. So had he lived, he might well have been in the gas chamber. In the event, he was killed by right-wing extremists, age 21 and 26, who's surprised? I mean, it's just that kind of, well, I don't mind saying rabble, people of that sort, who took his life right about that time in 1922. And I think that's symptomatic of where they're going, even in early Weimar. Because this guy was as German and as patriotic as it can get. But already this theory, the stab in the back theory, was beginning to gain currency. The theory that the German military had been betrayed by their own government. And result, a man of his incredible patriotism, dedication, and brilliance was somebody that, in essence, needed to be destroyed by, and was in 1922. And again, I think it's interesting, especially, and I know many of us love our stamps, like FDR or stamp people, and philatelists. Yes, philatelists like FDR. Yeah. So this is one, and you see how old it is, because that goes back before Euros, way back. But the idea is he has continued to be honored. This is probably a West German stamp, if you want to know the truth. Probably goes all the way back to that time. So it's very, very interesting to me that better late than never, that he has been honored for all he did for Germany, for the empire and the early republic. So all of this in is to say that by the early 20s, we have the settlement, but already it is filled with problems and concerns. I think sometimes, in my subsequent talks, I'll talk about efforts at peace and hopes and optimism for the future, and then plumb, we have the crisis, Wall Street, and we think, oh, but everything was just great up until that point. I don't know about that. Of course, I don't know if any time is just great, but let's just say that the issues that the Great War, World War I, created, and especially after the settlement. And I'm not saying any of us could have done any better, but I am saying that this Treaty of Paris, the Versailles business, seemed to have created some terrible issues that will be exacerbated by the German and Soviet problems and the problems with other parts of Europe. And of course, I suppose we have to throw the blame too on the United States for not being involved in this mess. But don't worry, we are going to have some interest because we never, ever should forget that at least until 1929, we had the money. We may not now, but we were rich back then. So you can read about it because we're not now. I hate to tell you, but we're not now. But we used to be rich, okay? So that's nice to think about. And I think we'll just pick it up there next week, okay? Thank you all. Thank you.
Nowhere to start.
Yeah.